There are evenings that arrive like a hand placed gently on your shoulder, not asking anything, not pulling you anywhere, simply reminding you that you are allowed to stop now, that the day has done what it came to do, and that the part of you, which has been quietly waiting for permission to rest, may, at last, have it. This is one of those evenings. In the north of a country where winters are long and full of deep blue light, there was a lighthouse that had not guided ships for many years. The sea it stood beside was still very much the sea, cold and wide, and entirely itself. But the ships had found other routes, and the lighthouse had gradually, over decades, become something else. Something quieter. Something that belonged to the land now as much as to the water. Its name, if lighthouses can be said to have names, was simply the Keeper's Light. Not because anyone kept it any more in the official sense, but because someone always had. There had been a keeper here for as long as anyone in the nearby village could remember. And though the particular person in that role had changed many times over the generations, the role itself had remained, adapted, evolved, become something the village understood without being able to easily explain. The current keeper was a man named Stellan. He was not old and not young. He was the age at which a person has made enough choices to know what kind of person those choices have made them, and has found, on inspection, that the result is something they can live with comfortably. His hair was the color of birch bark, pale, with threads of darker gray, and his hands were the hands of someone who worked with them regularly, not in a rough or calloused way, but in the way that speaks of consistent, purposeful use. He had come to the lighthouse 11 years ago. Before that, he had lived in a city and worked in a profession that required him to be precise and quick, and always slightly ahead of whatever was coming next. He had been good at it. He had also, somewhere in his middle 30s, understood with quiet certainty that being good at something was not the same as being nourished by it, and that the difference mattered enormously. He had left the city on a Tuesday in October, driving north for 8 hours with the windows down, even when it got cold, because he needed to feel the air changing, needed the physical sensation of moving away from one thing and towards something he couldn't yet name. He had found the lighthouse at the end of a gravel road that ended where the land ended, and he had stood at the edge of the cliff above the sea and looked out at the cold, gray, endless water and felt, for the first time in several years, that he could breathe all the way in. He had not gone back. That had been 11 years ago. Now he lived in the lighthouse keeper's cottage, a low stone building attached to the base of the tower itself, with thick walls and small deep-set windows, and a kitchen that smelled permanently of wood smoke and the particular mineral saltiness that the sea sends inland. The cottage had 4 rooms. He had arranged them in the way that suited him simply, with the things he used and nothing he didn't. In the kitchen, a long wooden table where he ate and worked and read, and sometimes sat for long periods doing nothing in particular, which he had learned to value as one of the more productive uses of time. A shelf of books along the wall opposite the window. a wood stove in the corner that he lit every evening from October through May, and sometimes in June when the sea wind came in cold. In the living room, 2 chairs facing the window that looked out over the cliff and the water. He sat in one. No one sat in the other, but it had never occurred to him to remove it. His bedroom was small and faced east, away from the sea, toward the low hills where the land folded itself gently, and where, on clear mornings, the light arrived with the particular quality of light that has traveled a long way to find you. And then there was the tower. He climbed it every evening, not because the light needed tending. It ran on a timer, the automated system having been installed years before he arrived, but because climbing the tower had become, for Stellan, the most important part of his day. The 112 steps, he had counted them many times, that took him from the ground floor of the cottage up through the stone spiral to the lantern room at the top, where the glass was thick and curved, and the view opened in every direction without interruption. He climbed slowly. He always climbed slowly. The stairs were worn in their centers, from 1.5 centuries of feet moving up and down them, and the worn stone had a polished look in the places where most hands had touched the iron railing. And Stellan liked these traces of all the people who had climbed before him. He liked the feeling of being part of a long, unbroken sequence of someone standing at the top of this tower and looking out at the sea as the light changed. This evening, as he climbed, the sun was still above the horizon, just barely, a wide band of deep amber, and rose lying along the waterline, the sea below it dark and silver, and the sky above it going gradually from the warm registers into the cooler blues of approaching night. He came out into the lantern room and stood at the glass and watched the last of it with both hands resting on the wide sill. The sea was calm. The wind had dropped in the late afternoon, as it often did at this time of year, and the water had that particular quality it only had when it was still, a kind of heaviness, a depth of color, as if the sea had inhaled and not yet let out its breath. He watched the sun touch the water. He watched it go. The sky above the horizon deepened from amber to rose to a color that had no name, something between violet and the darkest possible blue. And then the stars began, faint at first, 1 and then 3, and then a scattering, and the automated light behind him clicked softly on and began its patient rotation. Stellan stood in the turning light and looked out at the sea and breathed. The day released him here. It always did. Whatever had occupied his mind through the hours, the practical details of maintaining the cottage, the book he was reading, the letters he was behind on writing, the small and ordinary concerns that accumulate in any life, all of it settled and quieted the moment he stood at this glass with the sea below and the sky above and the light moving around him. He was not thinking about anything. He was simply here at the edge of the land, at the edge of the day, in the space between one thing and the next, where the air tasted of salt, and the darkness was coming in gently, and the world was, for this particular moment, perfectly still. He stayed until the cold came through the glass. Then he turned and began the slow descent. 112 steps back down to the cottage, to the wood stove, to the long wooden table, and the book, and the evening that waited for him, patient and unhurried and entirely enough. The village nearest to the lighthouse was called Vic, though most of the people who lived there called it simply the village, the way people do when a place has been home long enough that its name feels redundant. It sat in a shallow bay about 2 miles south of the lighthouse, accessed from the lighthouse by a coastal path that ran along the top of the cliffs, and then descended through a stand of wind-bent pines to the harbor. Stellan walked this path 2 or 3 times a week, usually in the mornings, to collect supplies from the small shop near the harbor, and to pick up his post, and to sit for a while at the cafe run by a woman named Brita, who made coffee the way some people made art, with total seriousness, and the expectation that the result would be taken seriously too. He was walking it this morning. The path was good, wide enough in most places, the ground firm with compressed grass, and the particular resilience of coastal earth that has been walked for generations. The sea was on his left, far below the cliff edge, a deep green-gray this morning, flecked with white where the overnight wind had been. The sky was high and clear. The pines ahead of him moved in a low, continuous conversation with the wind, their branches shaped by years of prevailing westerlies into a permanent gesture of leaning. He walked without earphones, without a phone in his hand. He had not owned earphones for several years. He found that he thought more clearly without them, and that the things he thought about on walks, the particular texture of an idea turned over slowly in the open air, were often the most useful thoughts he had. This morning, he was thinking about a letter he had received the previous day. It was from his sister, Anna, who lived in the city he had left, and who wrote to him with the kind of warm, slightly puzzled affection of someone who loves a person deeply, but cannot entirely understand their choices. She was not critical. She had long since moved past that. But her letters always carried the gentle undercurrent of a question she didn't ask directly. Are you sure? Are you sure this is enough? Are you sure you don't miss more? He had been thinking about how to answer this, not in the letter necessarily, but in himself, for himself. The truth was that he had thought about it honestly, and the answer was yes. He was sure. This was enough. He did not miss more, or rather, the thing he had had more of before had not been more in any meaningful sense, only louder. There is a difference between a full life and a loud one, and he had spent most of his 30s confusing the two before he found his way to the distinction. He came around the bend in the path where the pines began, and the sea view opened briefly into a wide arc. The bay below, the village on its far curve, the harbor with its small fleet of fishing boats, and the cafe just visible from here as a pale yellow rectangle against the gray of the stone buildings. He stopped, as he always did at this point, and looked at it. The village from here looked like something made with care and inhabited with ease. Smoke from several chimneys, a figure moving along the harbor front, the fishing boats rocking in the small, regular sway of the sheltered water. It was a scene that asked nothing of the person looking at it, which was one of the qualities he had come to value most in landscape: its complete indifference to being observed, and the freedom that indifference offered. He went on down through the pines. Brita's cafe was warm and smelled of coffee and cardamom, and the bell above the door made its familiar small sound as he entered. There were two other people in the cafe: an older man named Lars, who came every morning and read the same newspaper with the unhurried attention of someone for whom this was a genuine ritual, and a woman Stellan didn't recognize, who was writing in a notebook with the focused composure of someone deep in a private world. Brita looked up from behind the counter and reached for his usual cup without being asked. This too was a thing he valued: the way small rituals in a small community carried the weight of recognition without requiring its expression. She knew his order. He knew she knew. The coffee arrived without ceremony and was exactly right. He sat at his usual table by the window, which looked out over the harbor and the boats and the pale light on the water. He wrapped his hands around the cup and watched the harbor for a while. A gull landed on the prow of the nearest boat and stood there with the particular authority of a creature that has decided a thing belongs to it. The water moved in small, even rhythms. A man on the dock was coiling rope with the slow, methodical care that speaks of a task done hundreds of times, and done well each time, because being done well is itself the point. Stellan drank his coffee. He thought about Anna's letter. He thought about what he would say and what he wouldn't, and how there were things that were true for a person that could not be translated into language without losing some essential quality. The way a piece of music heard in a specific room at a specific time carries an emotional weight that cannot survive the description. His life here was like that. He could describe it accurately and completely, and someone reading the description might conclude, "That is very quiet. That is very small. Is that really enough?" And the description would be accurate, and the conclusion would be wrong, because what the description couldn't carry was the texture of it. The way the mornings here had a different quality of light than mornings anywhere else he had been. The way the sea sounded at night through the stone walls of the cottage, not loud, not intrusive, but present, like the breathing of something vast and unhurried. The way climbing 112 steps every evening, and standing in the turning light and watching the darkness come in had given him back something he hadn't known he'd lost until he found it here: a quality of presence in his own life, of being actually inside the days rather than processing them at a remove. He finished his coffee and ordered another, and took out the small notebook he always carried and wrote a few lines to Anna, not the full letter, just the beginning of it, the part where you find the tone and the thread. He wrote, "I have been thinking about your question, the one you don't ask." He wrote, "I want to try to answer it this time properly." He wrote, "I think the word I've been looking for is enough. Not small enough, not quiet enough, simply enough. The way water in a glass is enough. The way sleep is enough. The way morning is enough when you are in it." He stopped there. He read it back. He thought it was closer than anything he had written before. He put the notebook in his jacket pocket and looked out at the harbor, where the gull was still on the prow of the boat, unbothered and entirely content, and the water was doing its patient and faithful thing, and the morning light was moving across it in the way that light moves across water when both have all the time in the world. There was a room at the top of the lighthouse tower that most people never saw. Not the lantern room itself, where the great automated light turned its patient rotations through the night, but a small antechamber just below it, accessible through a low door in the stone wall that was easy to miss if you didn't know it was there. It had been, in the lighthouse's working history, a watch room, the place where the keeper would sit through the night watches, maintaining the light, logging weather and sea conditions in the official record. The log books were still there. They filled a low shelf along the curved stone wall, dozens of them, spanning more than 100 years of consecutive record. Each one was a different size and a slightly different color, bound in varying states of preservation, the spines labeled in different hands with the years they covered. The earliest ones were fragile now, the paper inside brown at the edges, the ink faded, but still legible in most entries. The most recent ones were in better condition, their entries brisk and factual: wind direction, visibility, vessel traffic, equipment status. Right up to the year, the light was automated, and the last official keeper had locked the watch room door and left. Stellan had a key to the door. He had found it on a hook in the cottage kitchen when he first arrived, unlabeled, hanging among several other keys whose purposes had taken him weeks to identify. When he had finally found the door, it opened and found the watch room. He had stood in the low doorway for a long time before going in. He visited the room regularly now. Not every day, but often, perhaps once a week, usually in the late afternoon when the light outside the narrow window was going gold, and the lantern room above was preparing itself for the night's work. He would sit on the low wooden stool that was the room's only furniture, with one of the old log books open in his lap, and read. The entries were, on their surface, purely factual. Date, time, weather, sea state, any notable observations. But read consecutively across years and decades, they became something else, an unintentional portrait of a life, or many lives, lived in this place at the edge of the world. The keepers had different styles. Some were sparse to the point of terseness. SSW wind, force 4. Clear. No vessels. All well. Others were more expansive, slipping occasionally into something that was almost journal writing. Observations about the behavior of the seals on the rocks below, the unusual color of the water on a particular evening, the way a specific storm had moved, and what it had sounded like. One keeper, whose entries spanned almost 20 years in the 1920s and 1930s, had a habit of recording the first and last light of each day in language that was entirely his own and entirely beautiful. He wrote, on one October evening, first light at 0714, the color of pewter and rose. Last light at 1652, the sea taking it in slowly like a breath. He wrote, the stars tonight are close. I have the feeling, common to this place, of being at the edge of something very large and entirely safe. Stellan had read that line many times. The feeling of being at the edge of something very large and entirely safe. He understood it completely. He had felt it on his first evening here, standing above the cliff. He felt it every time he climbed to the lantern room. It was, he had come to believe, one of the specific gifts that living at the margin of the land offered, the way the sea's enormous indifference, its scale and its age, and its complete independence from human concern, paradoxically created not anxiety, but relief. You were very small beside it, and this smallness was not diminishment. It was release. This afternoon, he was reading an entry from 1943. The keeper that year had been a woman, unusual for the time, noted briefly in a handwritten addendum at the front of the log as a wartime arrangement. Her entries were precise and unfussy, and carried a quiet authority. She recorded the weather and the sea and the vessels with the same factual brevity as her predecessors. But on one evening in November, she had written something outside the usual format, a single paragraph, indented slightly from the regular entries, as if she herself had recognized it as different in kind. She had written, "I have been thinking about what it means to tend a light. Not technically. I know the technical answer well enough, but in the larger sense, a light is not a destination. No one comes here. The ships I guide are going somewhere else, somewhere I cannot see from this room. My work is to help them pass safely through the dark and continue on their way. I give them a fixed point. I do not ask where they are going or whether they will arrive. I simply hold the light and let them use it as they need to. Tonight, I find this thought deeply comforting." Stellan read this 3 times. He set the log book in his lap and looked out the narrow window at the sea, which was the color of steel this afternoon, a long swell moving across it from the northwest in slow, even ridges. He was thinking about what it meant to be a fixed point. In the city, he had been in motion constantly, not the motion of travel or exploration, but the agitated forward motion of someone trying to stay ahead of something. He had not been a fixed point. He had been a moving one, and things had tried to orient by him and found it difficult because he was not steady enough to be trusted as a reference. Here, he was steady. The cottage and the tower and the cliff and the path to the village. These had made him steady in a way that had felt, at first, like loss, and had gradually revealed itself as its opposite. You had to stop moving to become a place other things could use as a bearing. He didn't know if he helped anyone the way the light helped the ships. That was not, perhaps, the right measure. But he thought about the people in the village who waved to him on the path, about Brita, who reached for his cup without being asked, about Anna's letters, which arrived regularly because she trusted they would reach him, because he was here, reliably here, in this specific place at the edge of the land. He was a fixed point. He closed the log book carefully and returned it to its place on the shelf. Outside the narrow window, the sea continued its long, unhurried work. He sat for a while in the watch room as the light outside changed, and he felt the old stone walls around him and the history in the shelf of log books, and the weight of all the people who had sat in this room and tended the light and thought their thoughts and written their careful records of weather and water and time. He was part of this sequence now. That, too, was enough. Autumn, the sea changed its colors daily. Stellan had noticed this in his first year and had never stopped noticing it. The way the water shifted through its spectrum with the weather and the season and the light, from the deep cold green of calm mornings to the dark gray green of overcast afternoons, from the near black of rough seas to the extraordinary silver gold that appeared for a brief window on clear evenings when the low sun hit the water at exactly the right angle. He kept no record of this. He simply watched, and the watching was its own form of record. This morning the sea was the color of pewter, as the old keeper had written, flat and smooth, and so evenly toned it looked more like metal than water. The sky above it was a uniform pale gray that was not threatening or heavy, but simply present, the way overcast autumn skies are present, without drama, without urgency. He was at the cottage window with his morning coffee, watching. The coffee was from a small roaster in the village, a new enterprise, begun 2 years ago by a young man named Petter, who had returned to Vic after several years studying somewhere, and had brought with him strong opinions about bean origin and extraction ratios, and the proper temperature of water, which Brita had initially regarded with the mild competitive interest of someone whose territory was being approached. They had in time arrived at a mutual respect that expressed itself as a friendly rivalry that was, in Stellan's observation, mostly a form of enjoyment for both parties. He drank his coffee and watched the sea. There was a quality to this morning that he associated with a specific kind of autumn, not the bright, leaf-turning autumn of inland places, but the coastal autumn that was darker and saltier, and came with a smell in the air that was not quite rain and not quite sea, but a combination that existed only in this particular combination of season and location. It was the smell of the year turning, of something completing itself. He had always liked autumn. In the city, it had meant the acceleration of things, the end of summer's relative slowness, the resumption of full pace, the sense of a machine returning to its full speed. Here it meant the opposite. The boats went out less. The path to the village was quieter. The evenings came earlier, and the wood stove went on sooner, and there was more time in the cottage, with the lamp and the book and the sound of the sea. He finished his coffee and put on his boots and coat and went out, not to the village this morning, but in the other direction, north along the cliff path, toward the old headland, where the path ended at a point of rock that jutted out over the sea, and from which, on clear days, you could see for what felt like an impossible distance. He had walked this way many times, and it never became routine in the way that dulled it. The sea was too variable for that. The light was too variable. The path itself was the same, but the experience of being on it was always new, because he was always new, slightly different each time, carrying a slightly different interior weather, arriving at the viewpoint with slightly different eyes. The walk took 40 minutes. He walked steadily, hands in his pockets, the collar of his coat turned up against the salt wind that came in off the water. The grass on either side of the path was beginning to go brown at the tips, and the sea campion that had been in flower all summer was now dry and white and rustling softly. The light was even and diffuse, no shadows, no directional warmth, just the flat luminosity of cloud-filtered autumn. At the headland point, he stood on the rock and looked out. The sea stretched north and west without obstruction, and on this pewter morning, it seemed to extend not just to the horizon, but beyond it, continuing into a distance that the eye couldn't follow. He had stood here on bright days when the water sparkled and the horizon was sharp and clear, and he had stood here on storm days when the sea was all white water and the wind made standing upright an act of intention. This morning was between those things, calm, gray, enormous, its scale undramatic but undeniable. A seal appeared below him, in the water near the base of the rocks. It surfaced slowly, first the dark dome of its head, then its face turned upward, its dark eyes looking at him with the frank and easy curiosity of a creature that has no reason to be afraid. He had seen seals from this point many times, but it always produced in him the same response, a kind of wordless gladness, not the excited gladness of an unexpected encounter, but the warm, settled gladness of seeing something you love appear in its right place. He and the seal regarded each other for a moment. Then it slipped back below the surface with a barely perceptible motion, leaving only a faint circular disturbance in the flat gray water, which spread and flattened and was absorbed into the general pattern of the sea. And then there was no sign it had ever been there at all. He stood for a long time after it had gone. He was thinking about disappearance, not in any melancholy sense, but in the simple, observational sense of someone watching things appear and pass and leave no lasting mark, and finding this not sad, but deeply natural. The seal had been here. It had looked at him. It had gone. The sea had accepted its going without comment. The morning had continued. Everything appeared and passed. The light on the water, the wildflowers along the path, the seals, the seasons, the keepers in the watch room with their log books and their observations and their careful records of weather and time. They had all been here, fully and really here, and then had moved on, and the lighthouse stood, and the sea ran, and the path continued to be walked. He was here now, fully and really here. That was the whole of it, and it was entirely sufficient. He turned and began the walk back to the cottage, the wind at his back now, the lighthouse coming slowly into view as he rounded the bend, its white tower against the pale sky, steady and familiar, already beginning to feel like his own. Petter, the young coffee roaster from the village, had a habit of appearing at the lighthouse on Sunday afternoons with a small bag of whatever he had been working on that week. This had begun in his first winter back in Vic, when he had knocked on the cottage door during a particularly cold February and asked if Stellan would be willing to taste a new roast and give his honest opinion. Stellan had said yes, partly because he was genuinely interested in coffee, and partly because he recognized in Petter the particular energy of someone who had come home from somewhere and was trying to find their place in the home they had returned to, which was always more complicated than the leaving had been. The Sunday visits had continued and expanded. They usually lasted 2 hours, sometimes 3, and had become one of the fixed points of Stellan's week in a way he valued without having articulated. Petter was in his early 30s, with the kind of quick intelligence that expressed itself not as sharpness, but as enthusiasm, a genuine, undisguised interest in almost everything, which Stellan found entirely refreshing after years spent in professional environments where enthusiasm was considered a kind of vulnerability. He talked about coffee with the absorption of someone following a genuine passion, but he also talked about books, about the village and its history, about his time away and what it had taught him and what it hadn't, about the specific quality of the light up here in the north that he had missed more than he'd known while he was gone. This Sunday, he had brought a natural process coffee from a farm in Ethiopia, which he explained as they stood in the kitchen while Stellan boiled the water. He described the altitude, the variety, the processing method, the notes he expected: stone fruit, a little floral, a long honey finish. He said this not with the performance of expertise, but with the excitement of someone about to taste something they had been looking forward to. They sat at the long kitchen table. The wood stove was lit. Windows showed the sea in its Sunday afternoon register, a deep green gray, the light coming from the southwest at a low angle that made the water look textured, 3-dimensional. A gannet was working above the water near the cliff, its white shape precise against the gray sky, diving in the clean, plummeting way gannets dive: total commitment, no hesitation. Petter wrapped his hands around his cup and tasted the coffee and closed his eyes for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Yes, that's it." Stellan tasted it. It was, as described, fruity and warm, and finished long and clean. "It's very good," he said. "I kept the temperature lower than I usually would for this origin," Petter said. "I was worried about losing the floral notes if I pushed the roast. I think it worked." "It did," Stellan said. They sat with the coffee and the warmth of the stove, and the gannet outside working the sea below the cliff. And the conversation moved easily from the coffee to Petter's plans for expanding the roastery, to the village and the question of what it needed and what it had enough of, to the broader question of what it meant to come home. "It's not what I expected," Petter said at one point. "I thought it would feel like stepping backward. And in some ways it does. There are things I had there that I don't have here. But the things I have here are," he paused, searching, "more mine somehow, more actually mine." Stellan recognized this. "The things here don't require a version of yourself that isn't quite you," he said. Petter looked at him. "Exactly," he said. "Yes, that's exactly it." This was what Stellan valued most in these Sunday conversations, the way they arrived, without great effort, at things worth arriving at. Not because either of them was trying to be profound, but because they were both simply talking honestly from where they actually were. And honest conversation from an actual place has a tendency to find its way to truth the way water finds its way downhill. After a second cup, they moved from the kitchen to the 2 chairs in the living room, which faced the window and the sea, and for a while they sat without talking. This was comfortable, had been for some time now, that particular ease in another person's silence that is one of the markers of genuine company. The gannet had moved on. The sea below was still the same deep green gray, and the low sun was beginning to thicken toward evening, the light going amber at its edges. Far out on the water, a container ship moved north, slow and massive, and dwarfed by the sea around it, its scale only apparent from this height. "I've been reading the old log books," Stellan said after a while. "From the tower. Yes, there's a woman who kept the light during the war. Her entries are," he searched for the word, "present, very present, as if she knew exactly where she was at every moment." "Was she here for long?" 3 years, Stellan said. "Then she disappears from the record. Someone else takes over without explanation. But her 3 years are complete somehow, as if she did what she came to do and moved on." Petter was quiet for a moment. "I think some people are like that," he said. "They arrive in a place completely, and they're fully there, and then when it's time, they go. No residue." "What would that take?" Stellan asked, not rhetorically, but with genuine curiosity. "I think," Petter said slowly, "you'd have to be very sure that you were enough in yourself, that your presence in a place didn't depend on the place." Stellan considered this. The light was fully amber now, the sea below it going darker, the evening settling in from the east where the sky was already a deep, rich blue. The automated light in the tower above them had not yet clicked on, but it would soon. He could almost feel the moment approaching, the way you sense a held breath about to be released. "She wrote something," he said, "about being a fixed point, about giving the ships a bearing without needing to know where they were going." "That's it," Petter said quietly. "That's what she had." The light clicked on above them. The beam swept out across the darkening water in its slow, faithful rotation, and the room around them brightened and dimmed and brightened as it passed. They sat in the turning light and drank the last of their coffee, and the Sunday settled into evening around the lighthouse with the patience of all good things coming to their natural end. Winter came to the lighthouse with a kind of authority that Stellan had come to respect deeply. It did not ask. It arrived in the shortening days and the strengthening winds and the change in the sea's character from the variable moods of autumn to the sustained, committed power of the season at its fullest. The waves in winter were not the waves of other seasons. They were architectural, purposeful, moving in long swells from the north that had traveled vast distances before arriving at this particular cliff and spending themselves in the cold spray and the low, continuous thunder of water on rock. He had been afraid of it in his first winter, not of the weather itself, not the physical fear of exposure or danger, since the cottage was solid and the path to the village was manageable in all but the most extreme conditions, but afraid of the darkness, of the long nights and the short days and the weeks of overcast sky that could make it feel as if the sun had withdrawn entirely from any personal interest in this part of the world. He had been afraid of what he might find in himself when the external world was reduced to this: stone and sea, and dark and wind. He had found, instead, that the interior life expanded to fill it. The cottage in winter was a world unto itself. The wood stove became the center of everything, the source of warmth and light, and the low, regular sound of burning. That was one of the most companionable sounds Stellan knew. He cooked more in winter, with greater attention, treating the preparation of meals not as a necessity to be dispatched, but as one of the day's worthwhile occupations. He read more. He wrote more the letters to Anna, which grew longer in winter, and the private writing he had kept in notebooks since arriving here, which was not quite a journal and not quite anything else, only a record of thoughts worth keeping. On storm nights, he did not climb the tower. On those nights, he sat by the stove with a book and a glass of something warm, and let the storm be exactly what it was: enormous, indifferent, entirely beyond his influence, and found that the acceptance of this was its own form of peace. The light above turned faithfully in its automated way. The ships that passed in the dark had their bearing. He was not needed up there, and being not needed was, in the right circumstances, a gift. There was a specific winter night he returned to in his memory often. It had been the second winter, in January, during a storm that had lasted 3 days. By the second night, the wind had reached a pitch he hadn't heard before, not violent, exactly, but sustained and immense. A sound that filled the whole world from horizon to horizon and left no space outside of itself. The sea beyond the cliff was invisible in the dark, but audible in a way that was physical, felt in the chest and the base of the spine as much as heard. He had sat by the stove with the lamp and a book he wasn't really reading, and he had let himself simply be in it, in the middle of the storm, in the middle of the dark, in the middle of the winter, in this stone cottage at the edge of the land. And he had felt, slowly and unmistakably, something he could only describe as being received. Not by anything in particular, not by the storm or the sea or the cottage, not in any mystical sense, but by something that the combination of all these things created: a quality of total presence, of being so fully inside a moment that the moment itself seemed to acknowledge you. He was here, completely here, without any part of himself elsewhere. And the world, the actual physical world of stone and fire and wind and salt water, was here around him, equally completely. And in the meeting of those two things, something happened that he had no better word for than received. He had sat very still for a long time after that. The storm had continued. The fire had burned. The light had turned above. He had felt, underneath everything, a bedrock of peace that had nothing to do with anything being easy or comfortable or resolved. It was simply there, had always been there, available whenever he was still enough to find it. In the morning, the storm had passed, and the sea was the particular color of rough seas that have calmed, a churned, living green, white-capped, but no longer driven, the surface moving in cross patterns as the water settled itself from different directions. He had climbed to the lantern room and stood in the cold, clear light and looked out at the aftermath, and felt it still, the bedrock, the stillness underneath the movement. He had tried to write to Anna about it. He had written, "There are things I want to tell you about this place that I can't find language for yet." He had written, "I think I am learning something, but it is the kind of learning that happens below the level of ideas." He had written, "I think the word is still, not still as in motionless, still as in what remains when the motion stops, the part that was always there." He had sent the letter and had not heard back about that specific part of it, which was fine. Some things you write not because they will be understood, but because writing them helps you understand them yourself. That was enough. That was always enough. In February, a woman arrived in the village who changed the quality of Stellan's winter in a way he had not anticipated, and did not, on reflection, want to have anticipated. Some arrivals are better received open-handed than prepared for. Her name was Maren. She had come to the village to finish a book. She was a botanist who wrote for general readers, and her current project was about the plant life of coastal margins, the species that existed in the particular ecological zone where land and sea met and competed and collaborated. She had rented a small house at the far end of the harbor for 3 months and arrived with several bags and a very large number of notebooks, and the competent, undemanding manner of someone accustomed to establishing themselves in new places and working there efficiently. Stellan met her at Brida's cafe on her 3rd day in Vic. She was at the counter when he came in, asking Brida a question about the local tidal patterns in a tone that was direct without being brusque. And Brida, who appreciated directness as much as she appreciated good coffee, was answering with full attention. When Brida introduced them, "Stellan keeps the lighthouse," she said, which was both technically inaccurate and entirely right. Maren had looked at him with an interest that was clearly professional before being anything else. "Do you walk the cliff path?" she asked. "Every few days," he said. "May I walk it with you sometime? I want to look at the sea campion and the thrift, and it would help to have someone who knows the path." "Of course," he said. They arranged to walk the following morning. She was already at the path's start when he arrived, notebook in hand, dressed for the weather in a way that suggested she had spent a good deal of time outdoors in cold coastal conditions. They began walking, and she immediately began noticing things, pausing to crouch and examine a plant, making quick notes in her notebook with a pencil, asking him questions about what he had observed at different times of year. He answered what he could. He had not, until now, known the names of most of what he observed, but he had been observing it for 11 years, and names or not, his observations were detailed and consistent, and she received them with the focused appreciation of someone for whom good data was, genuinely, a pleasure. "You've been watching this path for a long time," she said, at one point. 11 years, he said. "That's remarkable," she said, meaning it. "Most people who come to places like this stay for a season and leave. The plants respond to consistent presence, I think. The populations stabilize differently." He had not thought about this before, that his presence on the path, repeated over years, might have had an effect on the place itself. He found the idea deeply satisfying in a way he couldn't immediately explain. They reached the headland and stood at the point above the sea. She looked out and was quiet for a long time, and he understood that this was not the silence of someone with nothing to say, but the silence of someone genuinely looking. He stood beside her and looked too, and the sea was the deep winter green of its February register, cold and clear, and the sky above it was the pale blue of a winter clear day, the kind that has no warmth in it, but an extraordinary, clean clarity. "I've been to a lot of coastal margins," Maren said, eventually. "This one is unusual." "In what way?" "Usually there's a tension," she said, "the land and the sea in contest. Here it feels more like," she paused, "an agreement. As if they've been negotiating for so long they've arrived at something settled." He thought about this for the walk back. He thought about the woman keeper in the watch room, writing about being at the edge of something very large and entirely safe. He thought about his own sense, from the first evening, of being received rather than exposed. "I think the place is very old," he said, when they were back on the lower path among the wind-bent pines. "All coastal margins are old," she said. "Yes, but I mean it's had time to arrive at itself. It knows what it is." She looked at him with an expression that was considering rather than questioning. "That's a very good way to put it," she said. They came back to the cottage, and he made coffee, not with Petter's precision, but with genuine care. And they sat at the long kitchen table, as they had ended up sitting many times over the weeks that followed, with the notebooks and the wood stove and the window showing the sea, talking about plants and light, and the slow processes by which coastal places shaped themselves, and the things that lived in them, including, obliquely and by degrees, the people. Maren had a quality that Stellan came to value enormously over those winter weeks. She was clear, not blunt or sharp-edged, but clear in the sense of transparent, of being exactly what she appeared to be without layers of performance or management. She said what she thought. She asked what she wanted to know. She was interested in him in a direct way, and made no attempt to conceal this, and the directness of it was comfortable rather than pressuring. The way a clear day is more comfortable than a cloudy one, even though it offers less shelter. He understood, becoming less alone. Not in the sense of having been lonely before. He had not been, or not in the acute sense, but in the sense of an interior space opening that he hadn't known was closed. Maren's presence at the table, her notebooks spread beside his, the 2 cups of coffee, the sea in the window. It was adding a dimension to the winter that the winter had not had before. He was glad of it. Simply, without complication, glad. March arrived, and the light changed before anything else did. It was the first signal of the season turning, not warmth, not new growth, but the angle of light, the way it arrived each morning slightly earlier and from slightly higher in the sky, and struck the sea at a different pitch, pulling different colors from the water. The sea in early March had a quality Stellan thought of as awakening, not the full wakefulness of summer, but the stirring of something that had been very still, beginning to move. He had been writing more. The notebook pages had filled faster than usual through the winter, and he had taken to keeping it on the kitchen table alongside the books and the letters and the other materials of his daily life, reaching for it the way you reach for a familiar object without deciding to. He was writing about the lighthouse and the logbooks, about the keepers whose entries he had been reading, about what it meant to hold a fixed point. He was writing about the coast and the particular quality of attention that living here had developed in him. The capacity to be interested in small things, the patience for observation, the comfort with silence that was not emptiness, but presence. He was writing, in some sense, about learning to rest. He had not framed it to himself this way until Maren said it one morning when they were at the table, and she had been reading over his shoulder without his having given her permission, which was something she did, and which he had found he did not mind. "This is about rest," she said. He looked up. "Not sleep," she said. "Not laziness. The other kind. The kind you come to the cliff for, the kind in the watch room." He thought about it. "Yes," he said. "I think it is." "It's harder to find than it should be," she said. "Most people don't. They rest the body and think they've rested everything. But the other thing," she made the gesture he had come to recognize as meaning the whole interior machinery, the constant processing, the hum of unfinished thoughts and unresolved questions, that keeps running. "What stops it?" he asked. She picked up her coffee and looked at the sea for a moment. "I think different things for different people. For me, it's plants. Specifically the very slow ones, the lichens, the sedums, things that grow over decades. Being with them sets the pace differently." She looked back at him. "For you it seems to be the lighthouse, the repetition of it, climbing the same steps, the same view, the same rotation of the light." "The same," he said, "and different." "Yes," she said. "Always that." He thought about the watch room keeper who had written, "The river always does the same thing and is always different." He thought about the bedrock stillness he had found on the storm night. He thought about the seal that surfaced and looked at him and slipped back without a trace. In the weeks that followed, he found himself paying attention differently. Not more carefully, he had always been careful, but more openly. He had been, he understood now, a careful observer who observed from a slight remove, as if the glass of the lantern room were between him and what he was watching. The winter, Maren's presence in it, the log books, the conversations with Petter, the storm night and its bedrock, had moved him gradually from behind the glass. He was standing in the weather now. He felt this most clearly on a morning in mid-March when he was on the cliff path in a light rain, not a driving rain, but the soft, persistent kind that comes in off the sea without fanfare and covers everything in a fine, cold moisture. He had walked out without his hood up, which he normally wouldn't have done, and the rain was on his face and in his hair and on his hands, and the path was wet, and the sea below was the color of dark pewter, and everything was very close, very real, very immediate. He stopped on the path. He stood in the rain and felt it. He felt the specific coldness of the drops on his face, and the way his skin accepted them without resistance, and the smell of the wet grass, and the salt wind, and the rain itself, which had its own smell, a clean, ancient smell of cloud and distance, and the sound of the water below, and the wind in the pines, and the rain on the grass, all of it layered and specific and real. He was completely here, not thinking about being here, not observing being here from a professional distance, simply here in the rain, on the path, on the coast, in the morning, in March, alive and present, and entirely himself. He stood there for a long time. When he went home and dried off and made his coffee and sat at the table, Maren looked at him and said, "You went without your hood." "I did," he said. She looked at him for a moment and then smiled, not a large smile, but the particular kind that means a person has seen something they recognize and are glad to have seen it. "Good," she said. He thought so too. Spring at the lighthouse had a specific smell. It arrived before anything was visibly green, something in the air that carried the suggestion of warmth, the first hint of growth, the awakening of things that had been waiting in the cold ground through the months of dark. He had noticed it every year since arriving, and every year it surprised him by arriving before he was expecting it, as if the season were always slightly ahead of his calendar. Maren had noticed it too. She knew it better than he did, could name its components, the biological processes that produced it, the way it signaled changes in the soil chemistry and the plant communities along the cliff margin. He found her explanations added to rather than diminished the experience. There was something he had come to believe over his years here that she had articulated clearly. Understanding something deeply does not make it less beautiful. It makes it more specifically itself, which is a different and more sustaining form of beauty. She would be leaving at the end of the month. Her 3 months in the village were ending, her book progressing toward a conclusion, her notebooks full and organized in a way that suggested both the completion of a project and the beginning of the next phase of it. She spoke of this naturally, the departure, the return to her own life and home, the work that would continue, without the kind of elaborate delicacy that some people applied to endings, as if the ending needed to be softened by pretending it was not fully happening. He valued this in her. They had talked about it directly, one evening at the table, the wood stove burning its last fires of the season as the evenings slowly warmed. "I'll come back," she had said. "Not this year, probably, but the margin work here isn't finished. It's never finished." "You're welcome whenever," he said, and meant it with a straightforwardness that surprised him slightly, being less guarded than he was accustomed to being about such things. She had smiled. "I know," she said. "That's one of the things I like about you. You say what you mean without making it complicated." He had thought about this for several days afterward, turning it over, examining it the way he examined everything that seemed to contain more than its surface. He had not always been this way. In the city, he had been as careful and layered in his speech as everyone around him, saying things that gestured toward meaning without quite arriving at it. The lighthouse had changed this, or rather, the lighthouse had provided the conditions in which the change had been possible. The silence that required you to mean the words you used, since there were so few other sounds to fill the space. The last walk with Maren was on a bright April morning, the first truly warm morning of the year, with the sea a color he associated with summer previews, a vivid, alive blue-green that made the whole world look freshly painted. They walked the cliff path north, as they had done many times, and she stopped at the plants she had been monitoring all winter, making final notes, completing her record. At the headland point, they stood together as they had on the first walk. The sea below was bright and moving, the light on it fractured into thousands of points that shifted and recombined continuously in the way that water light always had constant movement, constant newness, within a pattern that was recognizable and steady. "I've been thinking about what you said," Maren said, "about the place knowing what it is. Yes, I think that's what happens to people who stay somewhere long enough," she said. "They start to know what they are. Not definitively, that would be too fixed, but in the way the coast knows what it is, settled enough to be a bearing for other things." He looked at the lighthouse, visible from here, its white tower against the spring sky. The light turned off in the daylight, but the tower itself steady and bright and entirely itself. 11 years, he said. 11 years, she agreed. They stood for a long time in the spring warmth, with the sea below and the coast path behind them and the lighthouse to the south. And neither of them needed to say anything more than what had already been said. And the morning held them both with the same easy, unhurried generosity that the place had always offered to those who stayed long enough to receive it. She left on a Tuesday, with her large notebooks and her field bag, and the same direct, unencumbered manner with which she had arrived. He walked her to the harbor to meet the car that would take her to the station. They said goodbye in the simple, unhesitating way that people who will see each other again can say it. He walked back to the lighthouse along the cliff path in the spring morning. The sea was bright. The pines moved in the soft wind. The path was firm and familiar under his feet, and the lighthouse at the end of it was as it always was, white, steady itself. He thought, she was here. She is gone. I was changed by her being here, and the change remains. This was how everything worked if you let it. He climbed to the lantern room that evening and stood at the glass as the light turned, and the spring sea held the last of the sunset. And he felt the whole year in him, the autumn and the winter storms and the logbooks and Petter's Sunday visits, and the rain on the cliff path and the bedrock stillness, and Maren at the kitchen table, and all of it, every piece, exactly as it had been, exactly as it was now. He breathed in. He was here. He was entirely here. Summer arrived at the lighthouse gently, and then completely. The days grew long, extraordinarily long, the way they did this far north, the light persisting until after 10 in the evening in a slow, amber refusal to fully leave, as if the sun were reluctant to let go of this particular stretch of coast. Stellan had experienced this lengthening every year and had never become entirely accustomed to it, which he took as a good sign. The capacity to continue being surprised by something familiar was, he had come to believe, one of the markers of a life being lived rather than merely processed. He had finished writing something. It was not a book, exactly. It was not a journal or a collection of letters. It was the thing it had grown into by being allowed to grow without being forced into a shape. A long meditation on the lighthouse and the log books, and what it meant to hold a fixed point, threaded through with observations about the sea and the seasons and the small rituals of his life here. He had not written it for an audience, but when he reread it on a June evening at the kitchen table, he found that it was clear and true, and said the things it had been trying to say. And this satisfied him in the way only honest work satisfies deeply and without fanfare. He wrote to Anna that week. He wrote, "I've been here 12 years now, and I think I finally understand what I came looking for." He wrote, "I didn't come here to escape. I came here to arrive, to stop the forward motion long enough to find the thing underneath it that was always there." He wrote, "I think that thing is what I would call rest, but not the kind that comes after effort. The kind that is always available if you know how to be still enough to find it." He wrote, "I hope you have some version of this. I think everyone needs some version of this." He sealed the envelope and left it on the table to post in the morning. Then he made his evening coffee and carried it up to the lantern room. Not the usual time. It was still an hour before the automated light would come on, but he wanted to see the summer sea in the long evening light, and there was no reason not to. And having no reason not to was itself a form of freedom he had learned to recognize and use. The sea this evening was the full summer blue of its most beautiful register, a deep, saturated color that seemed lit from within, moving in long, lazy swells under the warm light. The sky above it was vast and clear, going slowly through its amber progression toward the colors of the late northern evening. Far to the northwest, at the very edge of visibility, there was a sailing boat, small at this distance, moving slowly before the wind, its white sail a small bright point against the deep blue. He watched it for a long time. He thought about the keeper who had written about giving the ships a bearing without needing to know where they were going. He thought about the ships that had passed this light for 150 years, each with its own destination, its own cargo, its own crew of people carrying their particular lives across the water. The light had helped them all and known none of them, and been itself through every passage. He was, he thought, becoming more like that. Not indifferent, he felt deeply, valued deeply, was moved by things easily and without embarrassment about being moved, but less dependent on outcome, less invested in controlling what came next, more comfortable as a point of steadiness in the passing of things, present, available itself, not requiring the things that passed to be other than they were. This was the thing he had not been able to write to Anna's about until now. This was the word that had taken 12 years to find, not because it was hidden, but because you could only arrive at it by the long way, by the accumulation of seasons and steps and log books and storm nights and coffee cups and mornings on the cliff path in the rain. The word was simply here, not here as a location, here as a quality of presence, here as the state of being fully inside your own life, in your own body, in your own breath, without any part of you living somewhere in the past, or reaching forward into the future, or monitoring from a remove. Here as the ground under every other thing, here as what rest actually was: not sleep, not stillness, not the absence of movement, but the total and unresisted presence in whatever was happening, the receiving of the moment as it was, the being held by the world rather than the holding of yourself against it. He had been learning this for 12 years. He did not think he had finished learning it. He thought the learning would continue as long as he was here. And perhaps that was what the lighthouse had really been teaching him all along. Not a destination to reach, not a completed understanding to achieve, but a practice, a daily returning, a choosing again and again to climb the steps and stand at the glass and look out at the water and be, without qualification or condition, exactly where he was. The automated light clicked on behind him. The beam swept out across the darkening sea, and where it touched the water, the surface lit briefly with a moving warmth before the beam passed on, and the sea returned to its deep evening blue, and the beam came around again. Always the same, always different. He stood at the glass until the sky was fully dark and the stars were fully out, and the sea below was black and silver, rolling in its ancient rhythms, lit by the lighthouse every time the beam came around. The sailing boat was gone now, past beyond the horizon, on its way to wherever it was going, carrying its people across the water in the dark. He hoped they had seen the light. He hoped it had helped them. He turned from the glass. He descended the 112 steps, slowly, one hand on the cool iron railing, the worn stone smooth under his feet. Each step a familiar small returning. The cottage was warm. The lamp was on. The notebook was on the table, and the coffee cup from the morning was still there. And the window showed the dark sea, and the dark sky, and the stars, and the light above moving in its steady, faithful arc. He sat in his chair. He was not thinking about anything in particular. He was simply here in the cottage, in the summer night, at the edge of the land, in the long sequence of all the people who had been here before him and would come after, part of something larger than himself, and entirely at home in that belonging. His breathing slowed. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. The sea sounded against the cliff below, the same sound it had made 10,000 years ago, and would make 10,000 years from now, vast and unhurried and continuous. A sound that asked nothing of the person hearing it except to be still enough to hear it. He closed his eyes. The lighthouse turned above him. The sea held the night in its enormous, indifferent, generous hands, and Stellan rested all the way down into the deepest and most complete rest, the kind that waits for everyone who is willing to stop, to be here, to let the world hold them the way it has always been holding them, quietly and without condition, through every season, every night, every returning. The light turned. The sea breathed. The stars moved in their slow, faithful arcs. And the night received him, as it receives all of us, without judgment, without requirement, with only the one simple, generous, ancient invitation: rest now. You are here. You are held. You can rest.